Our subject is going to again be Atheistic Evolutionism, but it's going to be a subtitle of that known as Organic Evolutionism, which deals with the origin of life in general. If you remember last time, some of you are a little bit dazed at some of the scientific theories of cosmogony, but regardless of whether or not you were dazed, that all, of course, was the subject of evolution, but it was the evolution of non-living things, like our solar system, the moon, the sun, the earth, the planets, and all the things out there in the universe. And, of course, all of those are non-living things. Now, an even greater question concerning evolution comes to the forefront of our mind and study whenever we start looking at the subject of the origin of life itself. And, of course, particularly this evening, we're going to be looking at man, the origin of man. Some of the anthropological exhibits that the scientists have offered us for the missing link between that past ape, whichever species that was, and man today. We have various things that have come in between there according to what they say, and we're going to be looking at some of their theories this evening. We've got quite a bit of material here we need to go over. I want to start here by giving you a definition of what organic evolution is, which will contain several phrases that are peculiar to people that know something about or people that believe in or study evolution, and I'll tell you what those particular phrases mean here in a moment. Before I give you that, could someone come up here and get these charts? One of you brothers come and get these charts. There's, 5 or 6 of them? Just pass them out and try to get one in each group of people if you can. Not everyone can have one. I just have 5 or 6 of those. Sister Tracy Kerber did those for us. You've got a copy of this also in your book, The Genesis Flood. And by the way, of course, all of you are required to get the book, The Genesis Flood, and read it, but you don't need to be reading it now. You can wait for months before you even need to start that book. So don't be pressured by having to get through The Genesis Flood. It'd be best if you wait till we got through a few more things here, first of all, and then you can start into the Genesis Flood, and I think it'll be rather easy for you to go through. Now, I didn't give myself one. But anyway, I think I know what's on there. It's known as the geologic timetable. Now, this has to do with geology, and it's the standard timetable for geology and for the origin of all different forms of life. And you might want to look over that and jot down, you'll see down at the very bottom what's known as the Precambrian age. This goes back to, of course, the very beginning. You've got several forms of life there. Someone tell me some of those forms. They're real small, minor forms. Bacteria, marine life, algae, amoebas, things like this. Those were the first things to evolve. And that ought to be around 4.5 billion years ago. It's real easy to remember when they say that life began, because it's the same as the population of the world, around 4.5 billion years. So this is what the scientists say. This is when the scientists say life began, 4.5 billion years ago. And then going up to the very top of the chart, you'll see man somewhere along there at the very top. And you see a progression. I'll show you a little diagram here in a moment. You see a progression from those little simple things, marine life, up through your sharks and stuff like this, or through your sponges maybe next, and jellyfish, and then on up through larger animals like your sharks, then on up to dinosaurs, and then on up to prehistoric men, and then probably at the very top you would come up with your Homo sapiens, which is what we are classified as. And concerning when man got to the state where he is, they don't really know, but they put that between 1 and 2 million years ago, not billion though, but 1 or 2 million years ago. So you can look that over. I don't need those back. If you want to keep them, you can. Those of you that happen to get one of them, you can, or if someone else wants one, you can have it also. Okay, let's go back and let me give you a definition here of organic evolution. Organic evolution is, or means, life, this is one of my definitions again, life in its simplest form, spontaneously generated from non-living matter, and with the aid of two concepts in action. Now let me just give you a hint on how to write real fast. If you miss something, just because I'm going too fast, don't stop and wait till the next time I go around. Skip whatever you missed and try to catch up with me further on in the definition, okay? Then I won't have to repeat it so many times. If you miss a whole sentence, just skip that sentence and then pick up wherever I am. And then when I go back through it, you'll get it again. With the aid of two concepts in action. You see, if you don't have anything, just get that down, and then you can fill in around it. And these two concepts are the survival of the fittest and natural selection. You could put that in parentheses or something. Survival of the fittest and natural selection slowly evolved from the simple to the complex. Life in its simplest form, spontaneously generated from non-living matter. Now the things that you have at the very bottom of that chart I just passed out, of course, are living things. Now they're very, very small, like your algae and viruses and bacteria, mold, things like this are extremely, extremely small, but they are living. But you notice your chart doesn't go any below that. So where did that come from? That's what we're explaining here, spontaneous generation. And with the aid of two concepts in action, namely the survival of the fittest and natural selection, slowly evolved from the simple to the complex. So this is stating the case for evolutionism, organic evolutionism, that is. This is it summed up in a nutshell here. Now there are three phrases in this definition that I also want to go back and explain each one of these, and those three are spontaneous generation, this is all on your outline, survival of the fittest, and natural selection. Because all three of these things come into play very definitely. The subject of evolution. Spontaneous generation is also known as abiogenesis. That's on your outline, which we'll explain here in a moment. Abiogenesis. Okay, spontaneous generation is the immediate production of life from non-living matter by means of a correct molecular arrangement. The immediate production of life from non-living matter by means of a correct molecular arrangement. That is, the arrangement of the molecules. So you can see this in the very beginning of your definition. Life in its simplest form. Now, they don't claim that a human being just burst out of an egg or anything like that, but life in its simplest form, small, tiny life. Life in its simplest form, spontaneously generated from non-living matter. That is to say, this is matter here, but this isn't living. Used to be living. This pulpit used to be a live tree, but it's no longer living. And what happened? Now, of course, they didn't have a pulpit. They don't go back so far as to say exactly what it was, but this, in essence, is what spontaneous generation is. This pulpit, and all of a sudden, just spontaneously, that's where they get the word, a little piece just breaks off, and it starts living, and it starts growing, and it starts multiplying, and then, of course, it starts reproducing. That's what spontaneous generation is. You could trace it to anything that's non-living, and then you get life from that. And that's what abiogenesis is. Now, we believe in biogenesis. You can just take the word biogenesis. The word biology means life. Genesis means origin. So the word biogenesis means that life came from life. Now, remember, what do we do whenever we put an A in the front of a word? Just the reverse of what it says. Life came from things that were not alive. So that's what abiogenesis is. Life came from a non-living substance. And we believe in biogenesis. Life can only come from other living substances. which ought to be obvious. Like and kinds produce after themselves. A pulpit, something that is non-living, cannot produce something that's living. But everything that is living can produce something else that is living. So that's what spontaneous generation is. Secondly, survival of the fittest. Says that only the animals best suited for their environment will live in the world. They even have a TV program named after that. You might have heard of it before. It's called Survival of the Fittest. Only animals best suited for their environment will live. That is, as time goes on and on, things that are simply not correctly equipped to withstand, let's say, too much heat in the desert or too much cold at the North Pole or whatever, eventually will die, and only the things that are best suited for whatever environment that is will continue to live. And of course, there's a measure of truth in that. But there's a lot in that they are implying by survival of the fittest that's not true. And then the third thing is called natural selection. This is what natural selection is. It is the choice by nature of the right features for animals to help them best survive in the world. Natural selection. It's the choice by nature of the right features for animals to best help them survive in the world. Now you see, we don't have fins because that would not help us on earth. The things in water, nature has given them fins because they need fins to survive in water. They need to have gills so they can take oxygen out of the water. We can't do that. We need to have a different type of lung system and lung arrangement so we can take oxygen directly from the air. So you see, part of this is true. In all the different environments where you find different types of species, then there are certain things that some of them have that others don't have. But this definition here of natural selection, when it says the choice by nature of the right features for animals to help them best survive in their environment, nature is something inanimate itself. If you say that it's a choice by nature, then you have to make a personal being or a God out of nature. Because if I ask you, what is nature? What is nature? I mean, could you really give me a definition? Nature, it's outdoors. It's outside. You mean outside, Mr. Outside would be smart enough to say, now I'm going to give gills and I'm going to give fins to fishes, but I'm going to give wings to birds. You see, that's what they've done. They have made a personal being out of this thing called nature, Mr. Outside, Mr. Environment. And he's smart enough to figure out what I'm going to give to which animals. So that falls through right there for them. They think that sounds good, the choice by nature. But then they've got to tell us, well, what is nature? Okay, you had a question back here. Yeah. Yeah, they would include the plant kingdom too. So yeah, you go over all the whole world depending on where these different plant species are, and they all have particular things that are peculiar to their environment there. Another plant couldn't grow there. And of course the Christians, unless they understand the first 11 chapters of Genesis, and I could even go on up and say, unless they understood the Noachian deluge, then they're going to have a hard time to explain all this. They really are. Unless they understand the flood and what exactly the flood accomplished whenever it swept over the whole globe. It did some things that practically no Christians realize that it did. And that's why we have various changes, and I'm getting ahead of myself, but extinction of certain animals and a lot of other things. It's because of the flood. Now this ought to show you, give you a quick comparison of some different facts of, well, I'll get the evolution ones on there, the evolution, and then I'll put the Bible ones over on there. And this is pretty much the track that we've taken so far. You see, first of all, here, planets and stars are the result of a big explosion of compressed, rotating protons and neutrons. What's that known as? The Big Bang Theory. You see, you've got to start with the universe, start with an Earth, before you can start with life that lives upon that planet, that lives upon Earth. So they've got to go back, first of all, and find out how we got the universe like it is. So that's where evolutionists are going to start. Now, they, of course, are specialists in different fields. The ones that we will be looking at this evening major on man and the origin of man. But then, of course, your astronomers are your ones who major on theories of cosmogony. Then we've already said this. What is this point 2 known as? Life began by chance as a single cell from non-living matter. Spontaneous generation. Spontaneous generation. The third point, and this really sums all of evolution up here, this third point. All living organisms have developed from simpler forms of life. In other words, everything always goes from the simple to the complex. You never have from the complex to the simple. It's always from the simple to the complex. So that gets us life, that gets us on the road of evolution, and where do we end up? Well, they stopped with point 4, man is the ultimate result of the process of evolution. But then we've got a question to ask them here. How do we know that we're the last thing to evolve? If things have been evolving for millions of years, we're just a step in that evolutionary process. Sooner or later, all human beings will pass away, and a new type of unknown creature, much more intelligent than we are, much more organized than we are, is going to have to come about, according to their theory. There's no way they can say, now, I think this is the end of evolution. But, of course, that's what they've done. We've evolved up until man. Now, here's, of course, the Bible's response to each one of those. Planets and stars are the result of God's creating them out of nothing. Life, point 2, life and non-living matter were created separately by God. We see him, of course, creating all of the non-living matter for the most part to begin with. He had to get the universe and the earth before he could begin to create life and place life upon the earth. Then thirdly, God created separate groups of living organisms, each to reproduce after its kind, which rules out any theory of from the simple to the complex. And you see, friends, we've got people today, they are supposed to be going more complex, and we've got some societies that end up going backwards. And you end up with people like your Cretians and imbeciles and mongoloids and things like this. And they've gone backwards from this complex human being, Homo sapien, that they're supposed to be. Then finally, fourthly, man is the product of a special creative act of God. Of course, that was done on the 6th day. And he's a product of this special creative act of God. I'll just be mentioning something else while you're finishing. You have the evolution side. You need to go back on that side. Some of you need to go back there. I'll come back to the Bible side in a moment. It's a good way to have it set up so you'll see where we began and we end up with man here in evolution. I'll just go ahead and mention something else here. You see on your outline a mention of classical Darwinianism and neo-Darwinianism. Basically what classical Darwinianism says, and this is what, of course, Darwin started himself, is that man evolved from apes. And he didn't really go to the trouble and the time to take that back a lot further than apes. It was just basically that man evolved from apes. And whenever someone says the word evolution, that's generally the first thing you think of, that man evolved from apes. But neo-Darwinianism, and that is Darwinianism that has been arranged a little more, and new scientific data has been added to it, takes us back much further. I'll show you a chart of this in a moment, but takes us back much further than apes. It takes us back to the simplest form of life, and that is one cell. Some type of creature, as we'll see, it's known as an amoeba, that has one cell. Because obviously, if you can trace man back to an ape, then where did the ape come from? We'd have to trace that ape back to something a little bit smaller. It would go back to the amoeba. So no one just stops today with the subject of apes, believing that man has evolved from apes. They're going to do some more research and trouble and take us back a little further than that. It's interesting, some creationist has come up with this chart. You don't need to write all the zeros. I think there's 321 of them on there. Could life evolve by chance? The possibility of one protein molecule rising spontaneously out of non-living matter is one chance out of 10 to the 321st power, which is a figure of 1 followed by 321 zeros. Now, how much more foolish can you get, friends? I mean, people have to have been deceived by the devil to ever believe anything like this. It's much easier just to believe that God created us. We've got a better chance that that happened. So there we go as far as our chance that living matter came from non-living matter. 10 to the 321st power. And of course, why stop with the 321st? Why not 322nd? Because there's no chance as far as the Bible is concerned. So you could put 10 to I don't know what zero. I don't know why they picked that arbitrary number, but that's impressive enough for me to look at 321 zeros. All right, this is... you see Charles Darwin's book down there in the corner. And if you look on your the chart that I passed out, your geologic time scale, it's going to say basically the same thing. But here's where we have traced back to now, back to a simple one-cell creature. And there, of course, are more than just a one-cell creature, but this is the one that generally they say we originated from, and it's the amoeba. I guess I'll go up higher and then I'll come down lower. Because this is where you need to start, down here. Oh, the machine's over. There we go. Maybe I can bring that down again then. Starting down here from the very bottom with the amoeba. I'll go back up then. You know, you're not having to copy all this. I just wanted to show you here at the very beginning. Now I tell you, huh? I'm going to put it down here like I had it the first place. Now this is what can we see the man? There's the man, the one with the fuzzy head way up there at the very top. That's where we're wanting to get to, if I can say that and be incorrect in saying it. This is where we began from, right down here with the amoeba. And here's this long step, and you see where the ape is? He's all the way up here. So you see, it's not that there was an ape and there was nothing before him and we came from that ape. That ape is just the one thing below us. But then you've got to go all the way back here to your birds and reptiles, and then get back to your things that live in the water. Of course, they start with water. Got to get back to the things that live in the water. And of course, God made things to live upon the land in the first place. He created plants, and He created them on dry land, not in the water. Everything in Genesis 1, it almost precipitates the theory of evolution, because God is already ruling out all of their various theories that they began long before, of course, they've ever come about. What, the ape? We'll get to him in just a moment. He's on your chart there. Australopithecus, which means the southern ape. Or not your chart, on your outline. Well, let's go on and look at some of these examples here of man, of the various men that we've seen, and it's rather interesting when we study some of the most famous ones they have offered to us. And you see, this is the most serious claim, as far as we are concerned, that the evolutionists make, and that is that we evolved from something. If they're saying that cats and dogs and things like that evolved from other animals, that's one thing. But their most serious claim that they're making is that man himself evolved from the ape, and the ape evolved from the bird, and the bird evolved from the reptile, and the reptile came from 3 and 2-layered animals, and then 3 and 2-layered animals finally came from your one-celled creature, and that is your amoeba. And they've got all types of theories. One of the more popular ones that your educated scientists have at least now given up is that lightning struck a swamp one time where there was amoeba in the swamp. And when lightning hit that amoeba, it produced a chain reaction in the amoeba. Of course, he just went wild and started growing. I guess I would too if lightning struck me. But he began growing, and he grew up into a fish then. Now, amoeba is something microscopic. And how the lightning ever found the thing to strike it in the first place, I don't know. But it found this microscopic little creature known as an amoeba, and the lightning struck that thing, and he began to grow. And, of course, your molecules began to reproduce themselves within the amoeba. Now, don't ask me where the amoeba came from, because they can't tell you that. He grew up into a fish. Then pretty soon, the fish began to lose its fins that it had on it. It grew a tail, and it grew some little legs on it, and pretty soon it began to crawl up on the land. And there you have like a little toad frog or something. And the toad frog began to grow some more, and this is exactly what they believe. You're an ignorant fool to believe this, but this is exactly what they believe. The toad frog, as he went along, began to get some more hair on him. He had to be covered. You see, once he got out of the water and got on land, he had to be protected from the environment and from the weather around him. Began to grow fur and hair on him, and then in order to escape his predators, and I don't know where his predators came from, but in order to escape them, he had to get some wings on him, because that helps him fly better, and he can escape them easier. So he got wings on him. And then he devolved, as far as I'm concerned, went back to a creature that didn't have wings on him and went back to an ape, because you can get away a lot easier if you're a bird than if you're an ape. So he devolved backwards to the ape, and then the ape began to get smarter and smarter, and then he wanted to figure out how to invent a car so he could really get away in a hurry. So we end up with man at the very end, but really that wouldn't be the end. Maybe that's just the very beginning of evolution. Maybe we're going to end up with some type of super species that just, I don't know what it could do. You know, I couldn't even imagine what it could do beyond us. So that's where they begin to head then, in that direction. Now, as I've said earlier, because an ape is the thing that's most similar to us, that's why they want to go back and jump on that ape and start with that ape right away. They don't want to go back to a worm or something like that. That's too hard to prove any similarity between a human and a worm. It's much easier to prove the similarity between a human and an ape. So that's why they want to go back there. And for some of you, I had some questions here on another evening, I guess that was last time, so by someone who knew a little more about this, and maybe most of you do. I'm not trying to be real technical and giving you a lot of technical details. I mean, a scientist could come in here and give you all types of technical details, and of course you'd never be able to follow him. But what we're saying is none of this can be disproved by any scientist, regardless of what type of language they want to use. There's nothing that can be disproved by them. So we're trying to keep it, we're trying to get up on a high enough level so we'll be above Sunday school lessons, but staying away from being too technical, and we're just going to stay with some of the simple facts of it here. The first of the examples is known as the Cro-Magnon man. This is one of the more popular people. Now, haven't all of you heard of the Cro-Magnon man? Most of you have? Shake your head yay or nay so I can see. Some have, some haven't, of the Cro-Magnon man. I especially remember this, yeah. It's got the funny shaped head on him. I especially remember this because we had a friend that looked like a Cro-Magnon man. Oh, I shouldn't have said that, should I? It was before I was saved that we used to kid this fella, but the head slants back, and he's got a big head that shoots way out behind him and then comes back in at a sharp angle. And every time he lived on our same he lived on our same block, and when we'd get out there and shoot basketball, every time he'd get ready to shoot a basket, he'd jerk his head a couple of times. And his big old head back there, his head would begin to tilt, and the hair would wiggle back there like a string of beads hanging down on the back of his head. Well, it just wasn't shaped like your head. We called him the Cro-Magnon man. That was back when I was in the 7th grade, and I'd already heard of the Cro-Magnon man. I didn't know how to spell it or what he was, but I knew he was some type of ape that had a funny shaped head, and my friend reminded me of him. So we named him the Cro-Magnon man. Now, this man was named after a cave in France. This is, I'll tell you sometimes at least where, well, I guess all the time, where these names originated, so you'll know where they got this name. It was the name of a cave in France where the remains of this particular being was found. Now, remember that they don't find the being dressed in a suit coat or anything like that. All they find is the remaining bones, and sometimes not very many bones at that. And they begin to piece those together. Any missing bones, they just get some plaster of Paris and make their own bones so their skeleton will fit together like they want it to. And then they put the thing together, and of course he's got a very odd-shaped head. The forehead, slants back this way. It's not a drop-off, it slants way back this way. It looked like he's about to fall over backwards there. And of course they say, our head used to look like that. Thing is, I got a friend that still looks like that today. And that's the problem with a lot of these things. You can still find examples of these Cro-Magnon people. You can still find these things with us today. Getting back to the subject of this amoeba, we still have amoeba with us today. If they have evolved into a human, then why are they still? The amoeba is still a little one-cell thing. It's always been one cell. It always will be one cell. Why do we still have that thing with us if he's supposed to evolve into a human? Why not all these things? Why shouldn't all these things have been eradicated in the past? Because in a little amoeba, I mean, what is it? It's worth nothing at all. We ought to get up to the higher species and, of course, rule out all these other things below us. But all the things that we are supposed to have evolved from, we still have them with us today just like they've always been. We still have apes with us today just like the ones that we are supposed to evolve from. We still have them looking just like an ape today. See, there's no such thing as us evolving from them. Or we would have evolved from the ape, and the ape would have ceased to exist. And the amoeba would have ceased to exist. And the flatworm, and the bird, and all mammals, and we'd have nothing but human beings on the earth. The second man is known as the Neanderthal man. Have you heard of the Neanderthal man? You know a man that looks like the Neanderthal man. Hallelujah. Well, some of you have there again, and some of you not. This particular man, the Neanderthal man, was named after a valley, the Neanderthal Valley, in Dusseldorf, Germany. All these names are on your outline except things like Dusseldorf. D-U-S-S-E-L-D-O-R-F. For the content was named after a valley, the Neanderthal Valley, in Dusseldorf, Germany. All these names are on your outline except things like Dusseldorf. D-U-S-S-E-L-D-O-R-F. Dusseldorf. The remains of this man was found in the Neanderthal Valley in Dusseldorf, Germany. He was supposed to have lived 100,000 years ago. That is, when the scientists first found the remains of this particular being, they put a date on him at 100,000 years ago, but today, modern scientists, all modern science, classify him as a Homo sapien. So he's really no different from us at all. Now, the way that they determine these things on whether it is a man or whether it is an ape or something in between, the way they determine this is the size in the head, the capacity in the head for the brain. And it's measured in cc's, or cubic centimeters. And if it's around 500 cc's, that's about the size of the brain of an ape. When it gets up above 1,300 cc's, then that's about the capacity for a Homo sapiens brain. And if they find something in between that, then of course they try to make that into the missing link between the ape and modern man as he exists today. So 500 cc's is about the size of an ape, or anything below that also, of course. You could go below this, 500 cc's. And the modern man is, 1,300 to 1,500 cc's, cubic centimeters. Now, the same thing that was true with Neanderthal is true with Cro-Magnon. Both of them are recognized today to be nothing but a Homo sapien. The third example is known as the Australopithecus, which means the southern ape. Austral, A-U-S-T-R-A-L, just the word Austral. What do you think Austral means? Australia. Austral. Austral means south or southerly. That's where Australia received its name. It's at the southern part of the globe. And Pithecus is a word that means ape. Australopithecus, which is the southern ape. It was first discovered in 1924 by a man named Dart, D-A-R-T. There are various varieties of this Australopithecus that have been found. And the first one was discovered in 1924 by a man named Dart, and then not too much later, Another example was discovered by a man named Louis Leakey, Leakey. Louis Leakey discovered his southern ape in Tanzania, which is in East Africa. It's a country in East Africa, in Tanzania. And it received the name the East Africa Man, which I have a picture of, the East Africa Man. How many of you have heard of the Leakeys before? See, they're a famous family, a famous archaeological family that dig up looking for men's bones. Louis Leakey and then, of course, Richard Leakey, more modern. But it wasn't too long ago that the Leakeys were on, it's been a couple of years ago, with the Kenya Man, I believe, whenever they were on the cover of Time magazine. And the very famous family, the Leakey family, because of the discoveries that they have made. Let's see, there are several different men that will be coming up. This is on page 80 of this particular book on concerning fossils and evolution. Don't lose this place. This is what I want everyone to see on page 80 when you pass it around. But if you want to thumb back this way, you can take a look at several other men. Can you see this fella here? You see, what they've done with these apes and trying to show a transitional stage is gradually the thing has risen up off all four. And of course you see, some of you men like the Cro-Magnon man walking around humped over like this, and he's very, very hairy. And of course, the more modern he becomes, first he becomes a Homo erectus, which is the thing right before us, and then a Homo sapien, which is what we are. And gradually he's coming up and losing more and more of his hair until he gets standing straight upright, doesn't have hair. But then again, you find men today, human beings today, men that have a lot of hair on them, men that hardly have any hair on them. But if you want to turn back through here, you can see the Peking man, and I think the Java man, and several others are back here. But this starts off at least one example of the southern ape there. You'll pass that around. Well, I was going to come back. I guess I'll go ahead and explain on what these various things are. Whenever they find any of these remains, like this one that you'll be looking at here, they are always either one of two things. They're not a transitional stage. They are always either an ape or a human being. They can only be one of those two things. And they're trying to find some that look a little bit different each time, and then you just want to put them in a long train and say, this is how we came. But right in the same species of an ape, or just right here, we could look at all of your heads. You've got different shaped heads. All of us do here. Or for the most part, everyone's got some type of head that's a little bit different than someone else's. So we could line all of you up and pick out which one we think looks like the perfect head and which one looks like the worst head, and say that this perfect one must have evolved from this worst head. And that doesn't make any sense at all. So all of these things that they find, and this one right here, it's called the southern ape, that's all it is. It's just an ape. It's nothing more than an ape, nothing less, it's just an ape. And whenever they find some things like the Neanderthal man that has a funny shaped head, maybe funny shaped bones, maybe real big bones in him, different than what we have for the most part today, whenever they find these things, they're going to say it's either, an ape or something in between coming up until a human. What was the Neanderthal man? He was a modern human. And of course, he certainly didn't live 100,000 years ago like they guessed here. Let's say that he lived 5,000 years ago. That would be an old fella. That would be old remains. And maybe his head was shaped a little bit different than ours is today. So all of these different examples that they find are always either or, the ape or a human being. A fourth example is the Java man. You ever heard of the Java man? He's not quite as well known as some of the other ones. Your Cro-Magnon and Neanderthal, I guess, are your most popular ones until we get down to a little more recent man. Your Java man was discovered in 1891 by a Dutch physician named Du Bois, D-U-B-O-I-S. What Dr. Du Bois thought was that if he could only travel to the East Indies, then he'd be able to find, this is where he thought that man originated, was in the East Indies. And this is where the island of Java is, in the East Indies, near Indonesia, where the great revival with Mel Tari broke out back in the mid-1960s. The book Like a Mighty Wind, if you've ever read that book, Like a Mighty Wind from Timor, Indonesia, that's real near Java. But what he thought is that if he could get back to the East Indies, and he'd be able to find the very origin of man. And so in 1891, he found a skull with a capacity of 900 cc's. This is the first thing he found. A skull with a capacity of 900 cc's. And then later on, but real nearby where he first found this skull, he found a human thigh bone. Now I'm talking about a Homo sapien here. He found a human Homo sapien thigh bone. And what he did, he put the skull of 900 cc's, you see that's kind of in between, an ape of 500 and a human being of 1300 to 1500. It's kind of in between there. So what he did, he put this 900 cc skull along with his human thigh bone, along with some other bones that he found there, put all of it together, and of course he named it the Java Man, and it was spread all around the world in scientific journals. We finally found the missing link. You see, this is what all these examples that I'm giving you are an attempt to do. They're all an attempt to find the missing link between the ape and a Homo sapien today, which is something that we've never done. We've never been able to find a skeleton that proves beyond any shadow of a doubt that it is not an ape and it's not a Homo sapien, but it's something in between. And that's what's known as the missing link. The last example I'll give you this evening is by a man that's still alive today. He's just a young fellow today. And of course he has seen through the years and years of research that not only has no one ever found the missing link, no one ever will find the missing link, and so he's come up with a new theory that will be the last one we share with you here. Well, what Dr. Du Bois failed to tell anyone until 30 years later, he kept this a secret for 30 years, was that in the same place he found this skull of 900 cc's, he found two human skulls of 1550 cc's. Now he found these all together in the same place. And he didn't tell anyone this until 30 years later, just before he died. Now this is our problem. This creature of 900 cc's was supposed to be alive many, many thousands and thousands and even millions of years before this creature with a skull capacity of 1550 cc's. If these were supposed to live millions of years apart, how come we're finding them laying side by side in the same pit together? It would point to them being the same creature or something very similar to each other there. Now, even in an ape, friends, and even in a human being, you can fluctuate there a tremendous amount in the capacity for the brain. Just because I said 1,300 doesn't mean a human can't go below that, or that an ape can come above 500, because he can't. There are certain varieties of apes where the whole species itself, they all have a brain capacity above 500 cc's. So it's interesting that you're going to be able to find these things right together. And it wasn't until right before he died that he finally admitted that the 900 cc one that he found could not possibly have been a man. And he went on to say that these other skulls that he found were human beings, but look, they were living at the same time with one another. See, this is what the evolutionists are famous for. Digging down in strata. Strata, of course, is your layer of rocks that we have on the earth. Digging down in strata, it's the same evolutionary principle as from the simple to the complex. They say the deeper you go, the older it has to be. Everything up on top would be recent, obvious. The deeper you go, then the older it's going to be. But you see, they found Coke bottles in the very bottom of pits where they found million-years-old men, too. But the Coke bottle never gets into Time magazine, though. That's just a fact. They find Coke bottles and fingernail files and all types of things way down there at the very bottom where they're digging up these things that are supposed to be millions of years old. And, of course, we know how those modern things got down there. They got in an underground river. And, they could have been buried in the ground. An underground river or stream could have taken them very deep. And that's what they look for, is an underground river. And they dig at the very bottom of the river. Or a tar pit, or something like this. And they found a lot of interesting bones in the tar pit, too. But, of course, when we get back to looking, or we get up to looking at the flood in Noah's day, of course, we're not going to find anything as modern as a Coke bottle there. But that whole uniformitarian concept that the deeper you go, the older it has to be, of course, is just destroyed. Then fifthly, a fifth example is the Peking man. He was discovered about 25 miles from Peking, China in 1930. Several bones here. Now remember this also, never do they find the whole skeleton. It's generally just several bones. Sometimes it's more, this is being facetious, but sometimes they find a toenail. And they get that toenail and make a whole dinosaur out of one toenail. Or it's just one little finger, and they can tell by the size of that finger, I'm going to construct a whole human being. I know how big his brain capacity was and everything. Which is ludicrous to do that. They never find that whole skeleton down there. They just find part of it. The same is true with the Peking man in 1930. They found just a few bones. They began to match them together. The only problem with the Peking man was that during World War II, his bones were lost, and no one's ever seen them since then. That's one of the mysteries of evolution there. His bones were lost during all the confusion during World War II, and he's never been seen since then. So we got rid of the Peking man. Then another example a little nearer to home is the Nebraska man. Have you ever heard of the Nebraska man? The Nebraska man in 1922 in western Nebraska, a tooth was found. I'm not being funny on this either. Now this is the, can I call it the gospel truth? This is at least the scientific truth. A tooth was found in western Nebraska in 1922, and they constructed a whole ape-man, the alleged missing link from this tooth. See, it didn't quite look like ours, but it didn't quite look like an ape. So what are you going to assume? If that's what you're looking for, why not just say, this is it, I found it here. Not quite like ours, not quite like an ape, it must be somewhere in between. And they named him the Nebraska man. That was in 1922. However, in 1927, they found out this tooth was the tooth of a pig. And as one brother said in his book, this is one time a pig made a monkey of an evolutionist. That's not original, though. I have to credit that to someone else. Made a monkey of an evolutionist. I think a fellow down the street had a whole barnyard full of pigs, and he said, I know that tooth. My pigs have a tooth that looks like that. So that ruled out the Nebraska man. You see, every one of these so far have been destroyed. Seventh example is the Piltdown man. Discovered in 1912 by the director of the British Museum. He was digging in an ancient tar pit or a gravel pit near Piltdown, England. That's the name of the city, Piltdown. In 1912, he claimed that he found some bones that again looked like the missing link, the stage in between the ape and the Homo sapiens. And of course these were put on display, and once someone makes a discovery like this, all scientists of course breathe a sigh of relief. We finally found the missing link. But this was the greatest hoax of all the theories that we're looking at so far. In 1950, they still had these bones. They had been on display and had, of course, perpetrated the thought that this was the missing link. But then in 1950, it was discovered that these bones had been treated with iron salt. And, of course, this gives them the appearance of great, great age. They were very recent bones, but they were treated with iron salt. And they also noticed that the teeth had been filed down on the animal. Now, whether this was an ape or a man, I don't remember, but it was, of course, one or the other. And the scientific world themselves announced that this was quackery and a hoax. So they had to give up their theory of the Piltdown man. Then an eighth example is known as the Kenya man. This was discovered very recently by Richard Leakey. And what Richard Leakey said whenever he discovered this, and he's probably one of the world's leading anthropological archaeologist that exists today. Richard Leakey is. And whenever Richard Leakey discovered them, he said in 1973, so you can see how recent this is, that the remains of the Kenya man are much, much older than the Cro-Magnon or the southern ape, but he said that they're very modern. I mean, he's just backwards to what you'd think. He said that the remains are much older than the so-called Cro-Magnon and the southern ape. But he said they resemble very modern human beings. And his conclusion in 1973 was that all of the former examples that I've given you that had been in scientific books for years, he said simply could not be our missing link that we've been looking for so long. And he also said, the Kenya man that I have found is also not the missing link, and I don't know what to do. That's just what he said. And he's the leading one in this field. But he said all the exhibits that we've had before and the exhibit that I'm presenting to you, the Kenya man, none of these are our missing link. And see, what we've ended up with, what we've got here, dear friends, are people looking for things, looking for an illusion that doesn't even exist. It's like Ponce de Leon, who discovered the state of Florida. What was he looking for whenever he discovered the state of Florida? Any of you remember? Looking for the fountain of youth. Looking for something that never existed. He could have looked until he was Methuselah's age. Never would have found it. Coronado, one of his lieutenants, was the one who discovered the Grand Canyon. What was Coronado looking for? The 7 cities of Cibola. Never found them because they didn't exist. What are people doing? Scientists, educated men doing today? They're looking for the fountain of youth. They are looking for something that doesn't even exist. And they spend millions of dollars. Ponce de Leon, Hernando de Soto. I'm from Hernando, Mississippi, in DeSoto County, Mississippi. That's what we got our name after, Hernando de Soto, because he's supposed to cross through there, crossing the Mississippi, searching for things that never existed, and they gave their lives for their search. They all died looking for those things that never existed in the first place. Just like looking for a fairy tale. And this is what the men are doing today, looking for a fairy tale. Now, the last example I'm going to give you is by this man right here, Stephen Jay Gould. Stephen Jay Gould. He is a Harvard anthropologist. Of course, he's a professor at Harvard, an anthropologist. This is what Gould looks like. In the background, of course, is the outline of a Tyrannosaurus Rex that he saw for the first time when he was 5 years old. And the article says it frightened him when he saw this Tyrannosaurus Rex, and he decided to devote his life to studying dinosaurs and how they evolved and everything. And of course, he realized later on in his life, dinosaurs impractical to study. You can't bring him and put him under a microscope or anything like that. And now he looks for little tiny snails down in the Bahamas, I believe. He spends a lot of time down in the Bahamas looking for little snails, trying to see if he can get some type of evolutionary theory out of that. Stephen Jay Gould's theory is known as punctuated equilibrium. It sounds a little more scientific than the Cro-Magnon man. Punctuated equilibrium. And I'll pass this around. Please don't destroy this, though, because I want to keep this. This is the new theory of evolution. It's obvious that no one's going to find the missing link. Stephen Jay Gould recognizes that there is no missing link between the ape and the man today. So he's gone back to spontaneous generation for all practical purposes, except that he's saying life comes from other forms of life. In other words, there's not a step 1, a step 2, a step 3, and a step 4 leading from an ape up to a human. You just have an ape, and then all of a sudden it gives birth to a human. And then all of a sudden the human can give birth to something else without having any of those transitionary stages in between. And this shows it here. His theory as composed to the old theory that we're going to have to go from step 1 to step 2 to step 3. There was even back in the early part of this century a theory known as the monster theory, that a reptile laid an egg and a bird hatched out of it. That's the same type of idea behind it, that you would have, a bird coming from a reptile, or you would have a reptile just being birthed by a fish with no steps in between that. And you see, if you believe that, then you get yourself off the hook, because you don't have to find those skeletons in between the things. You don't even have to prove that at all. So he claims there are really no missing links in the first place. Well, let's go to our Bible and look at several things here before we close up. Now, we're not by any means through with evolution, or even, of course, we're going to go into theistic evolution next week, which will really be getting into even some more interesting things. But then after we get through with that, we'll wrap up the whole subject of evolution, and we'll give you a lot of other points to prove how evolution could not be true for us today. So I'm really not trying to prove it from any type of scientific theory or anything now. What does the Bible have to say about the origin of man? Let me give you several scriptures. Psalm 100, and I believe verse 3. Know ye that the Lord, He is God, it is He that hath made us. Now, the psalmist here is speaking of himself as a man. It is He that hath made us, and not we ourselves. We didn't evolve ourselves. Deuteronomy 4 and verse 32. Isaiah 45 and verse 12, which says, I have made the earth and created man upon it. I, even my hands, have stretched out the heavens, and all their hosts have I commanded. 1 Corinthians 15 and verse 39. We'll be back to more scriptures in, of course, 1 Corinthians 15 later on. 1 Corinthians 15:39. All flesh is not the same flesh. There is one kind of flesh of men, another flesh of beasts, another of fishes, and another of birds. Answers the whole evolutionary problem. Paul's writing on the resurrection, and he solved evolution for it. And Malachi 2 and verse 10. Have we not all one Father? Hath not one God created us? That's Malachi 2:10. Now I want to give you 3 points here, and then we'll close up. 3 things that evolution rules out. If we're going to believe in evolution, then there are 3 biblical truths that evolution unavoidably rules out. First of all, man could not have been made in the image of God, which the Bible, it labors to prove that man is made in the image of God. That's in Genesis chapter 1, verses 26 and 27. And that's also found over in James chapter 3. Man made after the similitude of God. It never says after the similitude or in the image of a beast. But also Romans 1, verses 21 to 25. Secondly, evolution rules out man's superiority over the animal kingdom, because he's no more than an animal himself. It would rule out man's superiority. Genesis 1, 26 to 28, and Psalm 8, 1 to 9. In Psalm 8 and in Genesis 1, 26 to 28, God said, I've made man to have dominion over all my creation, which would be just backwards to how it really happened. And then thirdly, evolution rules out man's fall into sin, because we know that to be a fall, a step backwards. And he says we've done nothing but come forward. And obviously, if we have this biblical truth ruled out, which of course is contained in Genesis chapter 3, man having fallen into sin, along with the first thing I gave you that evolution ruled out, and that is that man could not have been made in the image of God. If both of these things are true, that makes man no more than an evolved animal, which means that man is no longer responsible for his sins. He can't help them. He's an animal. And that's what the world teaches us today. Indulge in pleasures. You can't help yourself sometimes. Well, you can if you're an animal. You see, God doesn't hold an animal guilty because he told someone a lie. And if we are no more than an animal evolved, we couldn't be held morally responsible for any of these things. Not morally. You see, animals, they're not held morally accountable for the things that they happen to do wrong. If they kill another animal, God doesn't hold him morally accountable for that. You see, that means that God could not hold us morally accountable for anything, and that rules out the crucifixion of the Lord Jesus Christ. So to believe in any form of evolution, to believe in the gap theory, to believe in any form of revolution, in evolution, means that you are ruling out the crucifixion of the Lord Jesus Christ. Praise the Lord. The Bible says in Romans 1, professing themselves to be wise, they became utter fools. Changed the glory of the uncorruptible God into an image. Paul has a scathing denunciation of people that would dare to believe in evolution and worship and serve the creature more than the Creator. All contained there in Romans chapter 1. Now this will put us next time on theistic evolutionism, which I think we'll be looking first of all at the day-age theory. Next of all, we'll go into the gap theory, because that'll take more time. Any questions on that? Uh-huh. Yeah. One of many things that would rule that out. The theistic evolutionists try to get around that by saying that other things have evolved, but then that God has made man himself. There are various, you can be a restrained or an unrestrained theistic evolutionist that we'll try to get into a little bit next time. And the unrestrained believe that God is behind everything. Things did naturally evolve. God is behind it, but things still did evolve. If you're restrained, that means you try to be a little more biblical or a little more Christian. And they say that God, on each of those creation days, began a process of creation there. He did the initial creating, but it wasn't complete, and he let it evolve, and finally it got into the state that we know it to be today. A little bit different than your atheistic evolutionists who just try to rule God out of the picture entirely and completely. But you still end up back with the same results. You're trying to bring God down on our level, because we can't create anything. We can only make something out of pre-existing matter. So we assume that's how God must have done it. He made things out of pre-existing matter. But all of those examples right there, all of them, you see, have been proven to be false. Now, Gould's theory of punctuated equilibrium, you can't prove that to be false. I mean, it's so ridiculous you can't prove it. You can't prove that something just didn't come out of something else. But all these other ones, these bones, since they've actually given them, to the public, for the public to see or for scientists to see, it's something we can evaluate. And every one of them, all those famous men. And some textbooks actually contain things like the Nebraska Man, scientific textbook and a school textbook. And they had to be rewritten once these things like the Piltdown Man was proven to be a hoax. Remember, none of these things as far as evolution is concerned are science, because remember our definition of science. It has to be observed facts or demonstratable truths. No one observed it and no one can demonstrate it. So it puts it back into the category of being a philosophy or of being a religion. It's something you have to believe in with your heart if you want to understand it. You have to believe in it. But you can't prove it, though.
For a complete list of Brother